Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Julia McPherson. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Operations at Jesuit Refugee Service, USA. We're hosting today's discussion as our country experiences a tumultuous period. Earlier this month, days after the new 117th Congress was sworn into office, the Capitol became the focal point of violent and deadly riots. Tomorrow marks the inauguration of our 46th president, Joe Biden, and Vice President Kamala Harris. This transfer of power will take place amidst extraordinary security measures most of us here in Washington, D.C. have never seen before. Fellow Americans and global citizens around the world will be watching as U.S. leadership transitions to a Democratic majority in the Congress and a Democratic White House. As an organization committed to protecting the rights of all forcibly displaced persons, including asylum seekers, refugees, and those who are internally displaced, we at JRS are closely monitoring how the new Congress and administration might impact U.S. policy as it relates to these vulnerable populations. Over the past few weeks, and in collaboration with partners, we have shared our perspectives on the importance of U.S. leadership in refugee protection with the Biden-Harris transition team and incoming members of Congress. We also developed a petition outlining our key recommendations, including assisting refugees abroad, restoring the U.S. as a place of welcome, and stopping the use of hateful and discriminatory refugee policies. Everyone joining us here today is encouraged to sign the petition and to share it with your networks. We'll be delivering signatures to the Biden administration in the coming days. To date, we know that President-elect Biden has already committed to some policy changes that will impact refugees and asylum seekers. This includes increasing the number of refugees to be resettled in the U.S., which he announced at JRS's 40th anniversary event this past November. It includes reversing the migrant protection protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy, and rescinding the travel ban on some Muslim-majority nations, which we expect him to do tomorrow on his first day in office. But much is unknown about how the Biden administration will enact these changes, how much can be accomplished in the first 100 days of the new administration, and what role Congress will play in these efforts. Today, we're happy to have with us an expert panel to discuss the future of U.S. policy as it relates to refugees and those seeking protection from persecution, conflict, and violence, among other things. Each panelist will tackle an issue related to refugee protection, including access to asylum, refugee resettlement, and global refugee assistance and policies. But before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping items. The conversation today is being streamed on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It will also be recorded for future viewing and sharing. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to send any questions you have on whichever platform you're tuned into. Or you can send an email to communications@jrsusa.org. And let us know that you're tuned in by using hashtag JRSAdvocates. One word, that's hashtag JRSAdvocates. Now, to get us started, our first speaker is Bill Hing, Professor of Law and Migration Studies at the University of San Francisco School of Law, a fellow Jesuit institution. Throughout his career, Bill has pursued social justice through a combination of community work, litigation, and scholarship. He is the author of numerous academic and practice-oriented publications on immigration policy and race relations, and is a well-respected expert in his field. Bill is the founder of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco and continues to volunteer as general counsel for this organization. Bill will discuss the current state of access to asylum in the U.S., what the incoming Biden administration has committed to doing in terms of access to asylum, and what could or should be done in the first 100 days of a new Congress and administration. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us today, and thanks for getting us started.
Thank you for the introduction, Julia, and hello to everyone. I think that the issue I'm talking about, which relates to asylum seekers who are coming to the U.S. southern border is something that's real in a number of senses, not just that there are people that have been gathered there for some time, thousands and thousands, awaiting the opportunity to apply for asylum, but some of you may know or have seen images just this weekend of thousands of individuals fleeing, families and individuals fleeing Honduras just in the last few days, fleeing the desperate situation that they live in, that is violent and poor and corrupted, and is something that unfortunately affects the lives of so many. As Julia said, we're looking forward to President Biden following through on his promise to end what is called a Migrant Protection Protocol, MPP, often known as Remain in Mexico policy. This policy began in January 2019, and my students and I were there shortly after the beginning of MPP. And essentially what MPP does is it piggybacks on something else called a metering system, which I'll come back to in a minute. MPP requires people that are seeking asylum who are attempting to enter the United States not without inspection, but instead to enter at the port of entry. They're seeking to enter to apply for asylum. Instead of processing those individuals immediately and allowing them into the United States for an orderly processing, they have been forced since January 2019 to remain in Mexico. And I must say, they remain in some of the most desperate, awful situations along the border. What started in Tijuana expanded very quickly to the Mexico side of the Texas border and then to the Mexico side of the Arizona border. And I've been to all three of those places, and where the individuals are forced to live are in shelters that are dangerous, where murder, rape, and other types of violent crime are common. And human rights organizations have condemned MPP because of its terrible impact on the lives of the individuals and families that are gathered at the border. And the COVID situation has just exacerbated that. The metering system, which was something implemented in partnership with the United States and Mexico, is a system where before the pandemic, people had to wait on a wait list in order to be even interviewed at the border. And that metering system was corrupt, and it led to many, many claims of discrimination against different types of refugees from certain countries. And the refugees that were discriminated the most were those from African countries that were gathered at the southern border. The other thing that's happening at the border has to do with something called the third country bar. And that is a requirement that if you have traveled through a third country before approaching the US border, you must apply for asylum at that third country, meaning someone fleeing from Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador who has traveled through Mexico must apply for asylum in Mexico first. And the irony of that is that we are representing many Mexicans who are fleeing violence in Mexico, and Mexico is not equipped to handle this large volume of asylum seekers coming through those countries. But what has happened is, beginning with the Obama administration, but exacerbated under the Trump administration, Mexico is receiving funds to basically do the United States dirty work of trying to stop migrants from Central America to reach the United States. That led to my immigration clinic students and I filing a complaint with the InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights this past summer, and the commission granted us a hearing to hear about the human rights abuses that have been visited upon these asylum seekers, tens of thousands of them, by both the United States and Mexico. And the next thing I want to talk about is the effect of COVID. Since March, the middle of March, the southern border has been closed to these asylum seekers under the guise of protecting the United States from the pandemic. Now, we, of course, do not want people that are traveling to the United States who are infected with the virus to come and spread the virus. Uh, but but human rights experts and medical experts have agreed that the answer at the southern border is to not close the border because of the pandemic when you have human life at stake because of fleeing from violence. Instead, the smart thing to do for asylum seekers at this time is to process them and test them and to determine whether or not they have COVID or not, and then perhaps quarantine them for 10 days to 2 weeks, and then process them in an orderly fashion, because after all, they are trying to flee violence. The Trump administration took the exact opposite approach to this and used the pandemic as an excuse to close the border. So there have not been any processing of these asylum seekers. The other thing that has happened under the Trump administration deals with unaccompanied minors. Unaccompanied minors, and there's again been thousands that enter each year. When I visited a Border Patrol facility a couple of summers ago in Clint, Texas, that's where we found that the Border Patrol was violating its own regulations and keeping children in Border Patrol detention for more than 48 hours. In fact, they were keeping some of the children for 3 to 4 weeks in inhumane circumstances with poor food and poor health care. Now what is happening is when an unaccompanied minor comes to the border, they're not even getting processed. They're being turned away to where we're not sure, but there have been reports that unaccompanied minors are being turned away and are being so desperate that they've been abused or they've tried to cross the United States and gotten put back across the border by the Border Patrol. Finally, what the Trump administration decided to do in one of its major efforts at the border to stop asylum seekers is to come up with a different rule. And they put pressure on not just Mexico, but Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to sign what are called ACAs, and they're country agreements, asylum cooperation agreements, where those countries now are required by the Trump administration to handle asylum cases by people from the other countries. Now, that's been temporarily halted because of the pandemic, but this is what, can you imagine what's happening? Countries from crime-ridden, people from crime-ridden areas are supposed to go to another crime-ridden country and apply for asylum. And these are things that we have to call on the Biden administration to help restore an orderly asylum system and meet our obligations under international law to recognize the humanitarian purposes behind asylum and to allow orderly processing at the border at a time when people are even more desperate than ever because of growing violence and also the fear of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bill. Appreciate that. And really, helpful to hear, I think, how you are working with your students to get involved in these issues and to take action. And thanks for that overview. There are multiple things happening, multiple moving pieces. And I think in the Q&A, we can delve a little bit deeper into what we think the incoming administration might be able to do and how Congress may support those efforts. So we can pivot now to our next speaker, Jenny Yang, who is the Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy at World Relief. Jenny provides oversight for all advocacy initiatives and policy positions at World Relief and leads the organization's public relations efforts. She's worked for over a decade in refugee protection, immigration policy, and human rights, and represents World Relief's advocacy priorities to the US government. Jenny will provide an update on the current state of the US Refugee Resettlement Program and what the future holds for the program in a Biden administration. She'll also discuss the role that Congress plays in refugee resettlement and what we might see in the next 100 days. Thanks so much, Jenny, for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. So we're really at a time right now when the U.S. needs to take leadership again in humanitarian protection for refugees. And many of us recognize that we are facing the world's worst displacement crisis since World War II, where an estimated 80 million people have been forcibly displaced. And what that means is that the U.S. needs to look not only at our humanitarian assistance overseas, but actually look at our core humanitarian immigration programs and see what we can do to rededicate ourselves, both at a policy level as well as at a resource level, to make sure that we're doing everything we can to offer protection to those who have been forcibly displaced. Now, the United States has traditionally been the world leader when it comes to refugee resettlement, in that we have resettled the largest number of refugees around the world. And that has really come out of a core commitment to protection and humanitarian assistance from the president, from the White House, and through the administration. What has happened over the past several years has been really a systematic dismantling of the U.S. refugee resettlement program, where we went from being the world leader in refugee resettlement to really setting the lowest refugee ceiling in U.S. history this past year, when we set the ceiling for 15,000 for this fiscal year, and the historic average has actually been 95,000. And the reason why this is so unsettling is because we know personally of thousands of refugees around the world who are really waiting for the opportunity to be resettled to a third country like the United States of America. Now, it's important to recognize that this is a very narrow opportunity for millions around the world, because the U.S. Only resettles less than 0.5% of the world's refugees. What this means is that this is really a narrow opportunity for those who are the most vulnerable to find protection in the United States of America. And that's why it's critically important for the president and Congress to really work together to make sure that this lifeline of protection is available and well functioning for those who really have nowhere else to go. We know that resettlement is the third prong when it comes to durable solutions. So while most refugees ultimately want to return home, many refugees actually cannot return home and oftentimes spend decades in refugee camps or in urban settings in the countries in which they have fled. But for the very small number of people who really cannot go back home or locally integrate, resettlement is actually offered as the third durable solution for these individuals. Now, the UN has actually estimated that right now there are around 1.4 million refugees around the world who are in need of resettlement. These are individuals who cannot return home or cannot locally integrate. And the fact that the United States traditionally has been the world leader in resettlement means that we need to not only increase the refugee ceiling from the lowest of lows, which this year has been 15,000, but restore it to the 125,000 that President-elect Biden has committed to, and really work with the administration to make sure that we can actually reach the goal of resettling 125,000 refugees. In the next few days and weeks, there will be a lot of immigration discussion in our country. The president-elect and the president-elect, vice president-elect Kamala Harris have both laid out a really good, robust outline of immigration reform. And included in that are likely some provisions around the refugee resettlement program, what we can do to strengthen the program. But what we understand is that the president-elect has made a commitment to sign an executive order that would change the refugee ceiling from 15,000 to 125,000. But we believe that this is really the first step in the direction that our country needs to go in, and that there are other reforms that we need to see in the program to really help us reach the goal of resettling 125,000 refugees for this fiscal year. The first and primary thing is not just for the president to change the refugee ceiling, but to actually reform the program so that the program allows those who are most vulnerable to access the program. Over the past 2 years, the current administration changed the program so that you have to fit within a narrow category of admission in order to qualify for resettlement to the United States. What this has meant is that traditional refugees that have come in through the program, for example, refugees from Syria or from Iraq or from other places that have been extremely politically volatile, have actually not been able to access the program. In 2016, the U.S. actually resettled a little over 12,000 refugees from Syria. And this past year, we resettled only 481 Syrian refugees. This drastic decline of over 12,000 Syrian refugees is not only because we have set the refugee ceiling so low, but because many Syrian refugees cannot fit in the current categories that we have right now for admissions. And so right now, the predominant nationalities that we've seen through the program have actually been refugees coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo and from Ukraine as individuals who are fleeing religious persecution or are resettling because of humanitarian categories that we have set aside. We have been asking in the humanitarian community to really reform the program so that it's based on vulnerability for individuals from Syria and from Iraq, from Afghanistan and Pakistan that have nowhere else to go, but are in need of resettlement, can actually come in through the program through these reforms. So that is the main ask we've had of the administration, is not just resetting the ceiling, but of making sure that the program is based on vulnerability. The other thing we've been asking for from the administration is for the White House to appoint a coordinator that can actually oversee the resettlement of refugees nationwide. And the reason we've asked for that is because we know that there are many competing agendas when it comes to the need to reform our humanitarian programs as well as immigration, our immigration processes. But we believe having someone who is dedicated within the White House that can make sure that we reach the goal of resettling 105,000 refugees will ensure that we can actually meet this goal and really reestablish U.S. humanitarian leadership in the space again. The White House in the next few months not only will be making critical staffing decisions, but they'll also be establishing a budget that will ensure that we can actually provide humanitarian assistance, as well as actually fund the U.S. refugee resettlement program in critical ways. And so it has been our request of the administration, working with Congress, to make sure that there is a robust budget in place, as well as appropriations to make sure that we can do our part in providing critical assistance to those who have fled persecution. The United States right now is really at a critical juncture in which we not only need to send a signal to the world that we are committed to refugee protection through a robust U.S. refugee resettlement program, but making sure that we have the right people in place, leading the State Department and leaders in Congress as well, who can actually work together to make sure that we are offering as much support as possible to refugees around the world, as well as refugees in the United States. We believe it will be through these core critical decisions, by elevating the refugee ceiling to 125,000, by reforming the program to make sure that it is based on vulnerability and not necessarily these narrow categories of admission, and by ensuring robust appropriations in the budget to make sure the resources are there to follow through with our commitments. We believe these are the critical ways in which we will continue to see U.S. leadership on refugee resettlement. So yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share with you about some of our main priorities when it comes to refugee protection and refugee resettlement. And I look forward to hearing from you some of the questions you may have around this agenda.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. Really appreciate it. Giving us that really helpful and thorough overview. I know that there'll be some good questions coming about the refugee resettlement program, and you're one of our most available experts on this, so we really appreciate it. So we'll turn now to our final speaker, Kate Phillips Barrasso, who is the Director of Humanitarian Policy at InterAction. Kate has deep expertise in securing policies for improved humanitarian response and currently oversees InterAction's work on forced displacement, humanitarian financing, and partnership between NGOs and UN humanitarian agencies. Kate will tell us about the current U.S. role in providing refugee assistance overseas and U.S. engagement in global refugee policy efforts. She'll give us her thoughts on how the incoming Biden administration may approach these issues. Thanks so much, Kate, for joining us today.
Great. Thanks so much, Julia. And thanks to JRS for putting on this event. And of course, to everybody joining today to hear about this critical and pivotal point in U.S. policy towards refugees. So as we've heard from the other speakers today, there's clearly been an evisceration of the U.S. asylum and resettlement systems over the past 4 years that will take time and significant effort to reverse. And as the slogan of the Biden-Harris team goes, to build back better. Fortunately, the U.S.'s actions over the past 4 years on the international front, meaning the assistance that it offers refugees and hosting communities, and its actions in international humanitarian policy fora relating to refugees, have not been as destructive. That said, things certainly could and must improve with the incoming administration, not only because of some of the negative actions taken, but also because the situation, as we've heard from the other speakers today, globally has continued to become more worrying, and there are more pressing needs around the world. So starting with financing, which is one of the primary mechanisms the U.S. can use to assist both refugees and the countries and communities that host them. Funding for U.S. refugee assistance has actually stayed essentially the same during the last administration, largely due to the efforts of a highly supportive Congress, which has frequently exceeded what was outlined in the annual budget request the president submits every February. This actually, I should note, happened during the Obama administration as well, where you actually see the administration asking for less and Congress providing more, because there has traditionally been very strong bipartisan support for international refugee funding in Congress. So to provide an illustration of that really quickly, in FY17, the Migration and Refugee Assistance account in the budget, which essentially funds UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, NGOs responding on the front lines, and IOM, the International Organization of Migration, was at $3.35 billion. And in the current fiscal year, which is FY 2021, it's $3.43 billion. So it's essentially been flatlined. And in an arena of major steps back in refugee policy, flat, and also some significant financial pressures, that's a good thing. But clearly, it's still not enough. There are significant gaps in meeting the needs around the world. So while the Biden and Harris administration will have many priorities in terms of funding to ask for Congress, not least of which is for their domestic efforts to buffer the impacts in the United States of COVID-19, given their stated support for U.S. multilateralism and leadership in responding to global refugee crises, and with Tony Blinken and Samantha Power heading the State Department and USAID, if confirmed, we would hope to see this financial contribution grow. As Jenny, I think, noted, in 2016, right before the Trump administration, I think we were at a figure of something like 65 million displaced people around the world. We're now at 80 million displaced people. So all the trend lines are going in the wrong direction, and obviously requires more funding to respond to that. So while the funding has remained solid and we haven't taken major step backs, where the U.S. is going to have to really double down, and the new administration will have to focus efforts both in the first 100 days and beyond, will be in repairing and strengthening work on the U.S.'s role in international policy processes related to refugees, and in overarching diplomatic efforts to bring to an end refugee-producing crises and ensure borders remain open in countries of first asylum. So on the first point, the U.S. has largely been absent from critical policy discussions occurring on migration and displacement over the past 4 years. As many of you may remember, there was a high-level summit that was held in September of 2016 to address global migration and refugee flows, really driven by these historic displacement numbers, the Syria crisis obviously significantly fueling that, and an unprecedented flow in 2015 of refugees across the Mediterranean from Africa and the Middle East into Europe, which made it very clear, if it hadn't been before, that greater global cooperation was needed and greater responsibility sharing to assist refugees. So out of this summit came the New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees, which called for the development and adoption of 2 compacts, one on refugees and one on migrants. And the U.S. essentially in the following years, which coincided right with the beginning of the Trump administration, significantly just disengaged from these two very critical framework processes. The U.S. pulled out in December of 2017 from the Migration Compact, citing sovereignty concerns, despite the fact that the compacts are not legally binding. And the U.S. actually did stay engaged in the conversations around the development of the Refugee Compact, oftentimes actually publicly citing it as an opportunity for better responsibility sharing for refugees. In this case, actually from the viewpoint that the U.S. was doing too much and it was time for other countries to step up and do more. But ultimately, the U.S., along with only one other country, Hungary, voted against its adoption in December 2018 within the UN General Assembly. So in a similar vein, a year later, in December of 2019, at the first Global Refugee Forum, which is sort of a policy forum that was created to pledge specific contributions to meet the goals in the Refugee Compact, the U.S. made no pledges, no contributions, and did not really participate heavily in the actual Global Refugee Forum itself, which was a pretty disappointing, considering it was sort of a flagship event. So the incoming administration, we're asking, but it's really critical, that they take a really strong step in this first 100 days back into the Refugee Compact process, signaling that despite its vote 2 years prior against the Refugee Compact in the General Assembly, that they support its goals and actually call on other countries to meet their goals as part of that international process. But it's going to be critical, and as we've heard from the previous two speakers, for the U.S. not only to lead in calls for that and in rhetoric, but actually double down on its own its own actions to meet the commitments under the Global Refugee Compact, including on resettlement in particular. So you may also remember, it's a little confusing, there was a second summit on the margins of that really critical New York summit in 2016 that Obama, it was one of his final efforts in office, led, called the Leader Summit on Refugees. On the sideline of that was actually a U.S. led summit to elicit specific and new contributions from countries around the world in terms of financing, resettlement slots, and policies to both open up education systems in refugee hosting countries and job markets through the issuance of work permits. And the U.S. put a tremendous amount of political capital and muscle and diplomatic energy into eliciting these commitments from member states. You actually were not allowed to attend unless you put a well-vetted pledge on the table in advance. It was a sort of, people called it a pay-to-play model, really trying to get transactional and specific about what was being pledged. So it was really a tragedy of the timing that, obviously the administration changed hands. There was no follow-up, obviously, and owning the results of that summit. And so no one is quite sure exactly whether those pledges have been delivered. So we really are hoping and actually encouraged in a memo to the Biden-Harris administration that I think JRS contributed to, and that we've since given to members of the incoming administration, to immediately follow, sort of state that they want to revive the commitments that came out of the Leaders Summit, to start a dialogue with countries that committed to specific policy, financial, and resettlement slots that they pledged there, to see where that stands and announce their intentions to hold a Leaders Summit too. It would be a perfect way for this administration to come in, signaling that the U.S. is back. It would like to take a leadership position, pick up the pieces where it left off, albeit with a great pause and some major steps backward. And we're very much hoping, despite the many things that the Biden-Harris administration have on their plate, that they will take this really critical, symbolic, and practical step forward, because the groundwork has been laid for them. So the last point that I'll make is particularly on, what the new administration will have to do to repair significant damage and improve the U.S. ability to engage in humanitarian diplomacy. As we all know, the U.S. has retreated inward, taking a major step back from multilateralism and a leadership role it would normally play in diplomatic efforts to end conflicts ensure borders remain open to refugees, and that host countries treat refugees humanely and according to their international obligations. So given the massive steps backward in resettling refugees, and as we heard from Bill, externalizing the US borders, and the images that have been seen around the world of children, small children, separated from their families and held in horrible conditions, as we heard detailed, has really undercut the US's credibility to tell other countries to let refugees onto their territory, allow them to access basic services like school or medical care, and we're in a diminished position as a result. So despite that, and actually because of that, the Biden-Harris administration really has to double down, not only in talking the talk, but walking the walk. And that means in order to regain that credibility internationally, to exert that leadership role, it's really connected in, to our ability to let refugees into this country, to treat them humanely, to restore our asylum system. And it's really where you see that our actions at home, how we manage conflict at home, as Julia started talking about the events of January 6th, and ultimately how we treat refugee and asylum seekers looking for shelter at our own borders, that will very much influence our ability to influence other actors in other places that are critical in providing asylum space for refugees fleeing conflicts in places like Syria, Yemen, and now from Ethiopia, and the list goes on. So I will stop there. I'm happy to go into any of this further during the discussion. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Kate. And we really think it's important to not only consider the issues that are impacting those of us here at home, or refugees here at home, or who are trying to come to the U.S. through the asylum process or the resettlement program, but absolutely the points you made about the number of refugees and displaced or overseas, and the role that the U.S. government plays, a really critical role the U.S. government plays in ensuring that protections offered to those overseas is so important. And of course, to those of us at JRS, so much of our work is focused on helping refugees overseas, that it's an important part of what we're considering here today. So thanks so much for that really helpful overview, bringing us up to speed on where things currently are and where we hope things will be in the coming days and weeks. So now we have some time set aside for Q&A, and hopefully all of you watching have been absorbing some of the great information that's been shared already. And I think we already have some great questions that have come our way. If you do have questions and you haven't posted them yet, please feel free to post them on whichever platform you're currently tuned into, or you can send an email to communications@jrsusa.org. So feel free to keep sending us your questions. We're going to start with a question that was posed by Elizabeth on YouTube. So this question is for Bill. So Bill, you mentioned in your remarks that you've been doing some work with your students on asylum and access to asylum. And she asked the question, is the complaint sent to the InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights available? Why did you not submit the complaint within the U.S. judicial system? And maybe you can build on that question a bit by also telling us a bit more about how these kinds of efforts that you're engaged in help to tackle the limits that have been placed on access to asylum. So how are these kinds of efforts that you're involved in chipping away at some of the limitations that have been placed on asylum? And how can maybe you and your students continue to work on these issues in the new administration?
Thank you for the question, Elizabeth, and thank you, Julia. The complaint to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is available, and can we provide that link? I think I provided a link, Julia, to you last week on that.
Yep, we can post that, absolutely.
Yeah, and similar complaints have been filed in the U.S. judicial system. So litigators from ACLU to Southern Poverty Law Center, they have challenged everything that I mentioned, and unfortunately, the courts upheld the Trump administration's ability to pretty much implement MPP and the COVID bar and the third country transit bar, unfortunately. And that's why we went to the InterAmerican Commission. And that's also why we want the new administration to roll those back. We went to the commission because we wanted to get international attention, and we had a great reception from this multinational body at our hearing in September. I'm forgetting the date now. I think it's September or October, and they are about to issue their decision. I had hoped that they would be issuing it before the inauguration, but we have been given a signal, I don't want to jinx this, that they're going to send a very supportive decision denouncing the United States and Mexico's efforts at the U.S. southern border. Our students, I'm a little bit crazy. Julia knows that I am. I've known her now for many years, since the surge of unaccompanied minors in 2014. Our clinic actually has over 450 cases. They're primarily from Central America and Mexico. We've taken our students to Mexico. We've taken them to the detention centers in Texas, and we represent people that are in detention. And most of our clients are not in detention, but they're survivors, and they've gone through the most awful situations. The worst things you can imagine has happened to young boys and young girls and to their parents. This is not a fun thing. It's not just about poverty. This is about real human rights suffering. My clinical partner and I, Jacqueline Brown Scott, have traveled also to Honduras and Guatemala. In fact, I was in Guatemala exactly a year ago, the end of January, and in Honduras several months before that, just seeing what's going on. And the work is important. I must say that the Jesuit network plays a big role in all those countries in battling for human rights, and it's work that we don't have any problem recruiting students to help, recruiting volunteers to help. People are passionate about it, and I'll be honest with you, we're just not going to rest until the situation gets better for people like our clients.
Great, thanks, Bill. Thanks, that's so helpful to give us that very specific answer, but also more broadly in terms of what you hope to be doing, continue to do in the coming days and weeks. Appreciate that. Our next question is for Jenny, and it's on the Refugee Resettlement Program. It comes from Ahmed on Twitter, and Ahmed asks, what is the fate of refugees who have been waiting to travel for 4 years because of the Trump administration's policies? And I know that this question, is impacting a lot of refugees overseas, including refugees that JRS serves in the countries where we operate, where many of them were in the pipeline for consideration to be accepted in the Refugee Resettlement Program for resettlement in the U.S., and that was halted once this policy was put into place to limit travel from particular countries. So we know that this is on the minds of a lot of people in the countries where we operate. So Jenny, how would you respond to Ahmed?
Well, thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one, because I think behind all the numbers is individual people who have been waiting and oftentimes are in very vulnerable situations. And so what we anticipate in the next few weeks is that if the refugee ceiling is changed to 125,000 refugees, then it'll really open up slots for refugees to be able to come in through the program. And if the State Department actually changes the way the program is operating so that it is admitting people based on vulnerability, it's really going to open up, again, the doors for these individuals that have been in the pipeline for a long time to be able to come in through the program. We right now have over 100,000 refugees that are actually in the pipeline right now. That means these are refugees that have been referred to the program, are in the process of getting the security screenings or medical screenings. And so many of them have been waiting for over 4 years to come to the United States. But what it will take is not just a reform of the program, but the processing capacity will have to increase significantly. So the administration will have to make sure that individuals that are from the Department of Homeland Security can travel and actually interview the refugees. We will have to make use of video conferencing to make sure that we can interview refugees if we can't meet them person to person. There has to be an audit of the interagency process by the White House, we believe, because then they can identify inefficiencies and make sure that they're not duplicating checks over and over again. What we found on the processing side of things is that many refugees oftentimes have their security checks expire while they're waiting for other screenings to come in. And so we've asked for extensions of validity periods of them to make sure that they're not being redundant in their processing of varying degrees, and making sure that the process is run as efficiently as possible. And just to give you a story of one individual that we've been advocating for, there was a Pakistani Christian couple. The woman was, they were both married, and shortly after they were married, the husband was beaten literally almost to death in Pakistan for publishing Christian material on a website. Now, when his wife fled, she actually thought that he was dead. And it wasn't until she was resettled to the United States that they realized that he was actually alive. And so he was been living as a refugee in Sri Lanka for over the past 4 years. And for 4 years, we've been advocating for him to be reunited with his wife in Spokane, Washington, where she was eventually resettled to. There's been a lot of loopholes and hurdles to overcome for him to be able to come into the United States, and he still hasn't arrived yet. But we're hoping this year or very, very soon, he will be able to go through all the processes, make sure that they're all up to date, and be eventually reunited with his wife in Spokane, Washington. So as we advocate for a higher refugee ceiling, I think it's critically important, as was mentioned, to make sure that we remember that each number represents a story, and that as we advocate for reforms to the program, that we're really restoring humanitarian leadership and allowing people to restart their lives in the United States of America.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Hopefully we'll be hearing some hopeful stories of reunification, in the near future once the program gets up and running again. So let's pivot to another question. This is for Kate. Kate, this is another question from YouTube. And the viewer wants to know a little bit about how they can get involved and how organizations are working on these issues. So if organizations want to get more involved in policy and advocacy, maybe a local organization in the US, is there a refugee advocacy and policy coalition or working group that NGOs can plug into? So representing a membership organization that does a lot of this fantastic work, I'm sure you have a great viewpoint on this.
Sure. And thank you for the question, because obviously it's just all of this. I mean, even with friendly administrations, we have to sort of keep up the pressure, right? Like we have to make sure, even though we have seen some really positive signals that things could head in the right direction, it really does always require ongoing sort of beating of that drum. So to answer your question, there's sort of multiple layers of things that I would recommend. I mean, obviously, sort of like two of the major coalitions of NGOs that work on these issues, Interaction, which I work for on the international front, does have a forced displacement policy working group. Julia is actually one of our most active members in that group. We're constantly comparing notes on international policy processes. Also, I would note on internal displacement, which is also a super concerning and interrelated issue with those that become refugees eventually. And then Refugee Council USA, that focuses on U.S. resettlement and has a number of very, very organized groups that are, in addition to groups that operationally resettle refugees in the U.S., are some of the, most active defenders, protectors, thought leaders in that space. So if you are with an organization that would consider membership to either of those groups, those are sort of like the primary spaces where we organize. Outside of that, I would really encourage you as individuals to get involved in the action networks of individual organizations like JRS, like any number of the members of RCUSA and InterAction, and also obviously immigration-oriented action networks. It was really interesting during the travel ban during this just blur of a month that was January of 2017, to see Common Cause and some phone calls starting to happen between action networks that I don't think had ever been on conference calls with each other because of the nature of the threat and how significant and unprecedented it was, and how many different issues, were at stake, from immigration issues to human rights issues to refugee issues, et cetera. That broad coalition has not necessarily reconvened outside of these hyper crisis moments. But I do think that there is a need in an ongoing fashion to sort of bring together all these multiple different pieces, hopefully to see some sort of a mega action network that has only come together sort of cyclically at these really challenging times. But in absence of that, by all means, look to InterAction, Refugee Council USA, or individual organizations' action networks.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. And just to piggyback off of that, thanks for mentioning JRS and our action network. I mentioned it at the beginning, but again, if you would like to get involved today, right now, in terms of making refugee protection a priority for the new administration, please take a moment and consider signing and sharing with your broader networks our petition to the incoming administration. I think we'll be posting a link now. So if you haven't already signed your name, please do that. We're planning to deliver signatures in the coming days. So we have a couple more questions. Jenny, again, for you in terms of a resettlement. This is from Michael on Facebook. So he says, beyond banned countries, from what countries or crises might we see an increase in resettled refugees to the US in the next year or two, in 2021 or 2022? For example, should we be ready for more refugees from Venezuela? So if you can tackle that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're going to be seeing in the next few years is really a more diverse population of refugees coming in through the program, not only because we're going to see a higher refugee ceiling with the anticipated 125,000 refugees, but also because if we base the program based on vulnerability, then we will be resettling some of the most vulnerable refugees around the world. In 2016 and even the years before that, we did see a large number of Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees coming into the program. So I anticipate that because the UN estimates that Syrian refugees in particular are a large population of refugees that are going to be in need of resettlement, then the US will step up to their responsibility and resettle a larger number of Syrian refugees than we've seen in the past several years. Another emphasis of the administration that's been very interesting has been the focus on the Western Hemisphere and really responding to the violence in Central America and using refugee resettlement as a tool to alleviate some of the pressures off countries of asylum in Central America, as well as making sure that in addition to asylum, that a refugee resettlement process is working for those who are most vulnerable. So there have been active discussions within the administration to open up processing for refugees that are fleeing persecution in Central America. And so whether or not there's minors coming from Central America, or whether or not they're in the other individuals, we have to really ramp up our processing in the Western Hemisphere and really responding well to local effects of the political dynamics in the region in which we are. So I do anticipate that we will likely see a higher number of refugees coming from Central America and an amplifying of processing in that area as well. Over the past several years, we have seen a large number of Congolese coming from Africa. And so I do believe that we will continue to see a large number of Congolese that are coming in. And in terms of Venezuela, I also do believe that we will also likely see an increasing number of Venezuelans that are coming in as well. This really hasn't been a huge strategic focus of the current administration, but I know that with congressional support and with the administration looking at what is happening in Venezuela right now, that they're also going to be looking up to ramp up processing in regions in South America that are hosting large numbers of Venezuelan refugees. So overall, I think these are positive indications that we are really resettling some of the most vulnerable refugees. And I think what that means is that we will see a more diverse pool of refugees coming in the next several years.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So we have time for a couple more questions, which we have teed up. The next one, I think, is for you, Kate. And we were talking about the importance of overseas assistance, and much of that is directed towards crises that are happening all over the world, many crises that produce refugee populations or internally displaced persons. And one that a lot of us are hearing about right now is in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. So we have Cynthia, who asked the question, how do you think or predict the current crisis in Tigray, Ethiopia, will impact the efforts of these NGOs? Also, how quickly can something be done to support the people of Tigray, and also the violence that has happened to the Eritrean refugees in Tigray? So maybe, Kate, you could just talk about how does an incoming administration and new Congress sort of tackle these sorts of regional or country-specific crises that pop up?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I mean, if anything, this particular situation in Ethiopia should just show, like how dynamic a challenge that this is, right? There are some incredibly long-standing crises. We've talked a fair amount about Syria for good reason. We're going into a decade now of this massive humanitarian crisis and refugee crisis. And then you have breaking situations like the one in Ethiopia. And I think particularly for groups that have been working on refugee issues as it relates to Ethiopia, it's particularly concerning, right? Because we've actually seen some progress, as I think Julia knows, on some of the rights issues for refugees of other countries that are residing in Ethiopia, some progress being made there, right at a time when you see, some conflict breaking out internally and a new humanitarian crisis breaking. I think the main point that I'd put here is like, this is what the US government should be prepared to do, is just dealing with the dynamism around the world and making sure that it's aware of formulating conflicts. And I guess a point that I raised, but I really want to underscore here for the next administration, is there is not enough humanitarian assistance in the world financially to help people who have been forced from their homes. And it's not just a question of the monetary ability to assist people and material ability to assist people. Ultimately, when you talk to refugees, most of them want to go home. That is their primary objective. They obviously, hopefully, wouldn't have had to flee in the first place. And so this is the toughest nut to crack. But as a result, where most energy needs to be placed is in the diplomacy to stop the conflicts that give rise to human suffering and displacement that creates refugee situations in the first place, and makes those durable solutions that Jenny referred to, how few people actually end up going home, near out of reach for a lot of refugees. So, I mean, a general answer to that question is, the key tools to that are multilateralism, working with our allies, and having a leg to stand on in terms of the US's credibility, as I noted before, and being able to have that dialogue with other countries and offer advice and pressure, frankly, on some of the actions they need to take in order to stop conflict and stop the impact on and mitigate the impact on human life. So this administration, and I am hopeful that this will happen with some seasoned foreign policy professionals at the helm, not least of which is President-elect Biden himself, to be able to engage in those efforts in a way where we see less refugee crises being created and things stemmed from the outset.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I know we only have a couple minutes left. We have one final question. This is from Iman on Facebook. And Iman asks, is there any organization that offers legal support or legal advocacy for refugees in the US? So Bill, if you can take this one for us, representing our Jesuit law school at University of San Francisco, if you can help us answer this question for Iman.
Yes. First of all, there are a number of organizations in most metropolitan areas, and so it's kind of easy to check on that. I'm not sure if we can get something to people after the meeting, Julia, but there's a website where you can enter your zip code and find out the legal services in your neighborhood. But do check with local universities, because local university law schools often have immigration clinical programs, but also check with Catholic Charities, also check with the main legal services program in the county that you live in, because often they have immigration services. But there are definitely services available in most metropolitan areas of the country.
Great. Thanks, Bill. And yeah, we're happy to send, maybe Bill, you can send the link over to me, and we're happy to get it out to folks who joined us today. Okay, fantastic. Great. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour. We were getting some great questions in, so apologies if we weren't able to answer your question, but I will share any lingering questions with our speakers after we wrap up today, and we can post them to this post as well on Facebook, perhaps, and we'll make sure we get it out to all of you today. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. A special thank you to all of our speakers. We know that this is a busy time, so I really appreciate the time you took to prepare and to spend with us today. We do hope you can stay involved by learning more about these issues and by taking action. So again, please do consider signing and sharing our petition to the incoming Biden-Harris administration, asking them to make refugees a priority. And thank you again. We look forward to staying in touch. All the best.